My name is Liam Burrow, and I'm the lucky naturalist that gets to chat you through a couple of Africa's finest waterside and other scenes over the next 2 hours or so. But before we get too carried away with things here at Victoria Falls Safari Lodge, I'd like to remind you that we do try to keep these shows as interactive as possible. So please keep your questions, comments, thoughts coming to us throughout the show. Director Chulu and myself will be standing by, waiting to hear from you. So yeah, keep those questions coming. But a pretty serene looking day here at Vic Falls Safari Lodge in Zimbabwe, at the Vulture restaurant. Looks pretty relaxed. I don't think there's too much food left on the ground. Looks like the majority of these vultures and marabou storks have done their feeding. Time now to just do a bit of relaxation and a bit of sunbathing by the looks of that guy in the back with his wings spread open as they digest and carry on with their days. I mentioned in an earlier segment how critical these vulture restaurants actually are in the conservation process of the vulture populations in southern Africa. Our vultures, after all, are under pretty severe threat in a lot of areas, in particular from things like poisoning. So unfortunately there is quite a large illicit trade in vulture body parts, and those body parts are in demand from South Africa's or Southern Africa's traditional medicine industry. And yeah, unfortunately, as a result, carcasses are very often poisoned in some areas. The vultures fly in from hundreds of kilometers around, feed on something like a poison-laced cow carcass, and then die in enormous numbers. And then those bodies can be picked up, the wings are chopped off, I believe the feet and the heads are used as well. And the ecosystem suffers greatly as a result. So any opportunity to feed vultures and encourage them to stay in these wilderness areas, the protected areas, are a very, very good initiative. So long may this last at Vic Falls Safari Lodge. Still quite a few vultures coming in. I think they're spotting the amount of vultures on the ground as they're sort of soaring around thousands of feet above, and they're coming in presuming that there's something dead here. I don't know, perhaps I got it wrong. Maybe they're about to put some feed down. We'll have to see how it goes. But always a very exciting thing to see vultures in these kind of numbers. Now I mentioned that they fly at some pretty impressive heights. Now the highest vulture ever recorded was a Ruppel's vulture, a species found further up towards the equator into places like Oldonyo. You'll find them. And that vulture was recorded at 37,000 feet. And now it's not known whether that was just sort of an unusual one-off, or if vultures very commonly spend time at heights that high off the ground. But 37,000 feet is an impressive feat regardless. That is like cruising altitude for big jets. I was right. Here comes the guy with with some meat for our vultures. How extraordinary is that? Jeepers. Oh my goodness. Talk about an absolute swarm of vultures. Chaos. Now each vulture can eat a couple of kilograms in a single sitting, so there certainly isn't enough to give everybody a significant feed. hence all of this chaos. But a wonderful bonus for the birds that do manage to get something. Once again, those very tall birds that are quite clearly not vultures are marabou storks, a species of stork that specializes in feeding on carrion, feeding on dead meat. Now that's not all marabou storks eat. They'll also take insects, little crocodiles, frogs, that sort of thing. And they love a good fish, but meat is their specialty. And much like the vultures, they are an essential element of the natural world's cleanup crew. In the absence of these sort of scavenging birds, if you want to call them that, the bush is much more at risk of experiencing outbreaks of diseases such as anthrax, things that can be fatal for large groups of animals at a time. So while they may not be the most attractive, the most photogenic looking animals, vultures and storks, and they are very, very useful indeed. Hello Victoria, I'm looking forward to spending the afternoon with you as well. Nice to have you on board. And hello Joan Mello, and indeed the man right on schedule. Incredible that these vultures were arriving even before the food arrived. This must be a fairly regular thing at this time. Casper says, vulture feeding, what a wonderful daily event. Totally. Yeah, always a real privilege and a bit of excitement to see such a volume of them. And while I'm not getting the audio, I'm sure the audio for all of you at home was pretty chaotic. And they make some incredible vocalizations when they are kind of squabbling over food. And yeah, I guess you don't really get a great idea of scale with these vultures at quite a distance, but they are immense birds. And the whiteback, which is the bigger of the two vulture species here, can have a 6-foot wingspan. They get up to, I think, between 5 and 7 kilos. So we're talking like frozen turkey size. They are huge birds. Yeah, and I'm of the opinion that they're actually quite magnificent. Certainly they deal with pretty dirty things, but they're not particularly dirty birds. And they also bath very regularly, possibly multiple times a day, and certainly they do go and have a bit of a clean after they've had some food. Debbie has asked how long have they been running this vulture restaurant for. Debbie, unfortunately, I'm not quite sure about that. I know it's been on this Live at the Waterhole show for quite a while, but I would think it was running long before that. And certainly seeing kind of all of this disturbed, compacted soil around here, that tells me that this activity has been ongoing. A very regular spot. There are a couple of these vulture restaurants, as they're called, around. One or two in the Limpopo region of South Africa. And it is quite realistic that vultures from this particular site could even travel to that one a couple of 1,000 kilometers south in South Africa. Lady Macbeth has thankfully given us some clarification there. She says they've been doing this for 15 years. And hello to you as well, Lady Macbeth. Thank you. So 15 years it is. Wonderful that there are people out there taking this this vulture problem seriously. Taxi Lady has hit the nail right on the head. She says this proves that the vultures have a sense of time, as they were there before the food. Absolutely. Yeah. We must give animals more credit. They certainly show quite a capacity for intelligence, and certainly they can learn something like a feeding schedule down to the minute. I wonder if these guys are not hanging around in the hopes of a second round of entrees there. Can't blame them. So I mentioned that vultures soaring above would have a very, very good view of this vulture restaurant. I chatted to an ornithologist, a bird expert, who told me that the vision of vultures is so fine that from an altitude of 1,000 foot off of the ground, a vulture, if it wanted to, would have the ability to see the time on your watch. So certainly, from sort of an average cruising height of probably about 10,000 foot, vultures will see basically everything that's going on in the entire environment. And certainly we see it even during the lambing season for the impalas. I mean, an impala is not a particularly big antelope at all. A female impala will deliver a lamb. Obviously the placenta and the afterbirth and all of that is relatively small, quite a compact, neat little thing. I'd say not bigger than 3 or 4 of your hands sort of placed next to one another, and you'll have a vulture just arrive in the tree, sort of right next to where that's happened. So their vision is unbelievable. It was actually long thought that vultures were smelling meat and that they had a phenomenal sense of smell, but that has since been proved false. I suppose it makes enough sense when your life is spent sticking your head into rotting bodies. You perhaps wouldn't want to have the most phenomenal sense of smell. Looks like we're experiencing a bit of an exodus here. I guess feeding time for the day is over. Diane in the UK says, "Good afternoon, Liam. Vultures fascinate me with their aero skills and impressive eyesight." You and me both, Diane. Thanks for your comment. They are amazing. But yeah, we'll see what happens. And now these vultures do quite a bit of their digestion on the wing. But a vulture's digestive system cannot process a lot of the fragments of bone, occasionally entire whole bones, horns, hooves, etc., that they do consume when they're taking down gulps and gulps of meat at a time. So as that meat is sort of all digested off of whatever they've swallowed, they must regurgitate the bones, which they occasionally do from pretty dizzying heights. I was actually guiding on a little reserve outside Hoedspruit, doing a little bit of bush maintenance in the middle of the day between safaris with one of my field guide naturalist colleagues. And the two of us were clearing some bush, stood out in quite an open area, packing some having some erosion, trying to do a bit of habitat maintenance. And my colleague next to me sort of shouted out in pain and looked at me. And I sort of said, well, what happened? And he had a cut on the top of his head, and there was quite a large, sharp bone sat on the ground next to him. And I think for a second he thought I had thrown it at him, but it could only have come from a vulture soaring so high above us it was even out of sight. Unreal, what are the chances? But anyway, certainly an application of something like betadine to the wound on the top of his head, considering all the bacteria that must have been in that vulture's gut. And he was left with a pretty interesting story to tell. That might even be up. That's a pair of white-backed vultures mating there in the center of the frame. That's something I've never seen before. Shiv has asked, are the blue-backed birds a type of stork? Yes, they are, Shiv. They are marabou storks. Regarded as one of the ugliest birds on the planet. If you've never seen one up close, Google it. Marabou. Marabou. Yeah, they're certainly pretty unusual looking. I don't think they're hideous, but they're not not pretty by any means. And these hooded vultures, the ones in the frame at the moment with the very skinny bills, are sort of lowest in the pecking order. So they are just coming in now that all of the bigger guys have moved off, I think in the hopes of picking up little tiny fragments and scraps, which may have been left behind in all the chaos. Lady Macbeth says the Drakensberg Vulture Restaurant has an arrangement with local farms, which doesn't know about here. Quite right, Lady Macbeth. Yeah, it's a pretty efficient way on sort of all of the local farms around the vulture restaurant we're talking about here in South Africa. Obviously to deal with dead livestock that would otherwise be needing to be sort of incinerated or buried. Quite wasteful when you consider how valuable it is as a source of food to these vultures. They also are enormously resilient to diseases, so even things as serious as anthrax don't kill the vultures. So the quality of the meat is not really too much of a concern. Alrighty, well, with things kind of quietening down here at Vic Falls, I think it's time to check in at another one of our live waterhole locations. So let's head a bit further south into South Africa to Tau Lodge. So back over here at Madikwe, specifically Tau Lodge, right up on the boundary with Botswana to the north. A pretty sleepy scene by the waterside. I can see a couple of crocodiles just on the bank, sort of on the right hand side of the screen there. At least two. It looks like it could be quite overcast at Tau today. So in terms of basking, these crocodiles have their work cut out for them to some degree. It's a bit tricky getting their energy requirements met for today. And that's all three crocodiles set together quite nicely. Amazing viewing them from kind of back and behind. You can see just how fat and healthy, certainly the two on the left and right, but I'd say the one in the middle as well. Now these crocs are not struggling by any means. And as I've mentioned a couple of times before on this Live at the Waterhole program, a crocodile in a physical condition as good as these three are, is in a very, very good position indeed. Should hard times fall on them, they have the ability to last a serious stretch of time. I've heard as much as 2 years without food. Shiv says, "Oh, you are not kidding. Just googled the marabou stork, a face only a mother could love." A true story, Shiv. Yeah, they're certainly not pretty. But if you think about it, a bit like a vulture with those marabous sticking their heads into carcasses and whatnot, it pays for them to be a bit bolder on top, rather than having feathers getting all sticky and caked with blood and bodily fluids and that sort of stuff. So they are efficient after. We've had a couple of questions in recent shows as to whether or not these crocodiles have reproduced here at Tau Lodge. Now, certainly we've had no evidence to suggest that they have. I've never seen a small crocodile around here. We haven't really viewed any nesting behavior or mating behavior. And that's not to say that that hasn't taken place sort of off screen when we haven't been watching. A lot of crocodile nesting activity, certainly the activity of actually digging the hole and laying the eggs, probably takes place at night. But yeah, for me, the absence of crocodile hatchlings, at least even briefly, tells us that they aren't breeding. And they are certainly big enough to be doing so. A female crocodile can probably produce eggs from as small as about 2 meters in length, maybe a little bit more. These crocs are all well above that. I don't know, possibly we're sitting with a situation here where all three are males or all three are females. Very, very difficult to tell. And once again, these are Nile crocodiles. So the only species we get in southern Africa, one of 2 species in Africa. Around equatorial regions, sort of part of the Congo area, you find something called a slender snouted crocodile. A much smaller species, quite different looking as its name suggests. It's got quite a slender snout, a skinny skull. A bit of a yawn and some gaping from this guy off on the left. Danny has asked, why is that one sitting with its mouth open? Danny, quite simply, it probably comes down to thermoregulation. So as these crocodiles sit in the sun, their body temperature rises quite rapidly, and eventually they get to a point where they're starting to kind of overheat, and they will open that mouth to radiate a bit of extra heat, and if it gets completely unmanageable, they will return to the water. Spas asks, how big are the crocs at Tau in comparison with the crocs in other locations? Spas, these guys, I reckon, are probably around the 3 to 3.5 meter mark. So 9-10 foot, somewhere around there. Not enormous. Certainly one of the crocodiles that we see at Chitra Dam on Djuma is much bigger, maybe 4 meters. But yeah, I guess it's all relative when it's latched onto one of your legs. The difference between 3 meters and 4 meters is fairly inconsequential. Yeah, I've always had quite a large respect for crocodiles, and they have the potential to do enormous damage. And the fact that one could be lurking in water only a 1.5 foot or so deep, right at your feet, yeah, it's certainly led me to be quite cautious around the water's edge throughout my upbringing in Africa. And as quite a keen fisherman, I'm always very, very alert as to the presence of crocs as well. Definitely good to be seeing these crocs, and nice to be seeing them all together, Joan. Yeah, you may not think of them as particularly sociable animals, but they certainly have a social side. And so seeing them all sort of basking in the same place together is not particularly unusual. I've been fortunate on a couple of occasions to witness crocodile courtship in the wild, and it's a behavior that I would describe as tender, something that you may not attribute to a crocodile in terms of its characteristics. Certainly the way they feed and the way they fight might lead you to think they're pretty brutal, and I guess they do have that side to them. But when crocodiles mate, and again I witnessed this in person twice in the western sector of the Sabi Sands, the male crocodile in quite deep water swam up alongside the female, kind of brushed his face along hers very, very gently on both sides, blowing bubbles underwater the entire time, and sort of gently tapping her with sort of the very end of his nose. And then mating, quite fascinatingly, takes place in the water as well. And then following that, a few short weeks later, probably 2 or 3 weeks, that female crocodile hauls herself up onto land and chooses an appropriate nesting site in some nice soft sand. She'll dig down about 60 centimeters, so around 2 foot, and deposit anywhere between 10 and probably as many as 80 eggs for a really big individual. And the eggs incubate for 60 to 90 days. And as mentioned in previous shows, they are temperature sex dependent as well, which means the temperature of incubation within a fairly fragile range of a couple of degrees, actually determines whether or not those eggs will emerge, those little hatchlings will emerge as male or female. In the case of crocodiles, if memory serves, higher temperatures are male and lower temperatures are female. and the opposite is true in turtles and tortoises. Yeah, the concept being that that crocodile is going to lay eggs in layers, so she's obviously not laying them all flat. So there is a bit of a thermal gradient in the nest. So obviously the eggs lowest in the soil, furthest away from sort of exposure to the sun's heat, will be coolest, and kind of the top half, if she's constructed the nest nicely, will be quite a bit warmer. So hopefully, in theory, you get a nice spread, sort of a 50-50 split of the offspring in terms of what gender they're going to emerge as. Isn't nature amazing? But all right, I think in the interest of keeping things moving and letting a sleeping crocodile lie, let's head over to Tembe to see what's happening. So back over at Tembe now, at a reserve very, very close to the kind of southernmost boundary with Mozambique in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa on our east coast. We are chock-a-block with elephants. Isn't that marvelous? Looks like a couple of plain zebra in the back as well, but a really wonderful mix of ellies today. A couple of very big bulls. I did think that one or two of those might be cows. I wonder if this is not all bachelors again. We'll see as they do a bit of moving. So generally, visually trying to sex elephants can be a little bit tricky. The general rule is that if you take a look at their forehead, viewed from the side, the forehead of a bull is very angular. The forehead of a cow, or rather the opposite. The forehead of a bull is very large, broad, and rounded. The forehead of a cow is sharp, bony, and angular. But there's a bit of variation. I've seen a couple of cows with quite round foreheads and a couple of fairly bony looking bulls. But checking them out as they kind of spread out here, they all look male to me. Yeah, in terms of the bulls, it can be a bit tricky because most of the genitalia is fairly internal, so you don't always get a very, very clear idea. And as we know, the bulls also get quite a bit bigger. And males probably max out at somewhere between 6 and as much as 8 tons. Females probably not more than about 4 tons. Yeah, the two kind of center screen here have both got radio collars. It's interesting, one of them does appear to have quite well developed breasts between her front legs. I think that's a female. But yeah, weird to have one single cow mixed in with all these bulls. And it is a cow. Yeah, normally we would expect to find females in breeding groups. So I wonder what's going on here. Perhaps this female is ovulating and feeling the need to sort of meet up with a bull to have her eggs fertilized. A bit of chaos going on in the back there with those zebra thundering around. I don't think that's due to a predator. I think they're just frolicking. Certainly very exciting for these ellies, who seem to be chasing them all over the place. How cool is that? There's also a warthog that's completely caught up in the middle of all this. And again, I can't hear anything from this location, but you must be getting lots of trumpeting. Ellies get very vocal when they are excited. That is some awesome elephant behavior. Rita says, laugh out loud, Ellies are such bullies. So certainly, Rita, they can be quite cheeky. Pick on someone your own size. Yeah, without a doubt, that one with its bottom pointed towards us is an adult female. Quite a bit of this behavior, kind of getting touchy-feely, very flirty with these bulls, tells me she's possibly an estrus cow. I reckon her family must be somewhere reasonably close, somewhere within earshot. Under any normal circumstances, you won't see a female on her own, unless she's very, very sick or something like that, and this cow isn't. Some aggression towards those zebra and warthogs still going on in the background there. I think just for the fun of it, because they can. It's funny, we seem to see cases of, I've always called it short man syndrome, in kind of smaller elephants, particularly sub-adult elephant bulls, and they don't really have the confidence that seems to come with adult size in male elephants, confidence and calm. So these younger bulls can be very, very cheeky, often taking out their booming testosterone levels in this sort of rowdy behavior. Kenneth Gamble, hello sir. Kenneth says that was very, very funny. It was. Spending time in nature, we often have some good laughs watching animal behavior. Some things can be difficult to explain. A lot of it is just silly for the sake of being silly sometimes. Tina Skilton, who I believe is a new member. Welcome, Tina. Wonderful to have you joining us, and thanks for taking the time to submit a comment. Tina says she wouldn't want to stumble across these three. Certainly, you've got to be a bit careful with Ellies. They can be cheeky. But I've spent quite a bit of time on foot with elephants, occasionally in very close proximity. And if done properly and safely, it can actually be a wonderful experience. But as I say, it has to be done quite safely. Elephants have the potential to be extremely dangerous, in particular the females. Perhaps a bit contrary to what you may think, the bulls are often pretty relaxed and quite approachable, provided they're not breeding, not in a must cycle. But cows, get a bit too close to a breeding herd of elephants, and elephant cows would make you wish you were in a different country. Certainly, I've heard lots of accounts of elephant cows just refusing to leave people alone on walks, often following groups of people on walking safaris for miles as the walkers try and get out of the way of them. They can be pretty relentless. Joan Mello says she's never seen Ellie's mate. Must be interesting. Joan, to be perfectly honest with you, in 12 years of guiding, I've only been lucky enough to see it a single time. Once, something like 12 years ago, 11 or 12 odd years ago. It is definitely very, very interesting. Yeah, and certainly seeing a big 6 or 7 ton bull up on his hind legs trying to mount a cow. It's not often you see an elephant doing something as precarious as that. So it's yeah, pretty unusual. Yvonne asks, which animal took you a while to warm up to? Yvonne, I'm going to have to give that a bit of a thought. Maybe like rodents. I've never been a huge fan of rats and mice, and still to tell you the truth, probably not so much. But pretty much everything else I find pretty interesting. I like the spiders and the frogs, and certainly snakes, scorpions, all the weird, creepy stuff that people usually aren't drawn to. Tends to be my bread and butter. I like that stuff. But yeah, a scurrying rat or a mouse, certainly in close proximity to me, not my favorite. But yeah, as I've said so many times before on these live at the Waterhole shows, there is value and, if I may say, beauty in every living thing. If you're willing to take possibly the fear or a bit of a threat of danger out of it, and basically every natural thing can be interesting. And I think as small children, we're perhaps more tuned into it. You take a small child out into the garden and show them a slug or a snail or a grasshopper moving around in amongst the plants, and you have a little person that is instantly fascinated. It's just tragic that so many people lose that wonder for the natural world. Yeah, I think we should be encouraging the kids to be outside more and more. I certainly spent most of my childhood running around outside, catching snakes, looking for chameleons, that sort of thing. Both of these elephants with kind of their heads lifted, their ears cocked slightly forwards, and that bull on the right even doing something we call a periscope sniff, very clearly lifting his trunk up there, clearly scenting something on the breeze. Whether that is another male elephant, perhaps a musk bull being drawn in by this cow, it's impossible to say. Without a doubt, these elephants have one of the finest senses of smell in the natural world. It's reckoned to be many thousands of times stronger than the finest drug-sniffing canine, drug-sniffing dog, trained for our purposes in the human world. Taxi lady says, I defy you to warm to the Scottish midge. Taxi lady, you're probably right. A bit tough, a bit difficult to get interested in something like a midge. But I suppose even a midge has its value. I'm sure there are some birds out there that are big fans of your Scottish midges. But it may stop at the birds. Now that he's done with his flirtation, looks like this guy is getting down to one of those daily elephant essentials, a bit of splashing and wallowing in this mud. Process is essential for keeping cool on a hot afternoon and keeping things like the midges and biting flies off. Now you may have noticed at least two of the individual elephants that we've been looking at have been fitted with radio telemetry collars. Certainly the large individual far off on the right hand side of the screen there. See that kind of bump between the shoulder blades just at the back of the skull there, and that is the telemetry unit itself. So these radio collars are occasionally fitted in our wilderness areas as a tool for monitoring these animals. Elephants, as we know, cover vast distances in their movements annually, occasionally even leaving the safety of these reserves and going as far as to cross borders. I'm not aware of whether or not these particular elephants do cross into Mozambique to the north, but it's certainly possible. And it serves us very well to keep an eye on them, make sure they're not going into rural communities raiding crops. And if they are starting to head that way, it gives the elephant management teams a chance to warn people and perhaps put something in place to prevent that. Now we've got a few more cows emerging on the scene. These two in the frame, without a doubt, are females. Some beautiful long skinny tusks on the third cow, which has just emerged there. Again, Tembe is renowned as an area of pretty phenomenal elephant genetics. Historically, a number of absolutely immense bulls have kind of developed in this area. A contributing factor is probably the vegetation and the quality of the rainfall that does tend to fall in this area, but a large amount of it comes down to that elephant's genes. If it holds the rare recessive gene for immense tusks, and it's given everything it needs, it could develop a set of tusks that grows throughout the 40 or 50 years of its life to a point where they almost drag on the ground as it moves. Now there aren't many of those elephants around. There's sort of a sprinkling of them across Africa, probably less than 50. But we are lucky to catch glimpses of them occasionally. We've been fortunate to see the magnificent 1 ton at Old Donyo a number of times. I've seen a couple of those big bulls in parts of the Kruger, and even viewing Ezelwini with Wild Earth a couple of times in the Greater Kruger. Now the future of those bulls is by no means secure. The demand for ivory on the rise, and certainly elephant poaching in some parts of Africa absolutely out of control. We have a huge responsibility to keep those big tuskers, but all of our elephants as a whole, nice and safe. Yeah, essentially the justification behind the taking of those tusks is not even medicinal. All people want them for is for carving. to carve them into really foolish trinkets and chopsticks and bangles and all sorts of silly things. And when you think of the cost socially of having an elephant shot in one of these groups by a poacher, it's an absolutely devastating loss to the rest of the family, and you lose all of the knowledge that elephant carried in its body, which it was passing down to younger individuals in the group. And I think it's a loss to humanity. It's a loss to all of us. You can do your bit to prevent poaching in Africa, and certainly to fight against it, simply by avoiding the purchasing of any ivory items in your travels. If you do end up in a place like China or Vietnam and you come across them, they are beautifully carved, and certainly the people selling them may tell you that they were taken from tusks dropped onto the ground, but the truth of the matter is a very different story. If the buying stops, the killing can too. And certainly the only thing out there that needs an elephant tusk is an elephant. Thankfully, Africa's wild spaces are home to something like 350,000 elephants. So that is a very sustainable population. There's a huge hope for the future for that population to grow. But it does require some conservation, and for people to come together and change their ways, and as I say, stop buying ivory. And now that the majority of the bulls seem to have moved out of the way, we are seeing cows emerging. Many of these ladies with very, very impressive tusks. Cows and calves. This is a breeding group, a breeding herd. Arguably one of the most structured family units in the natural world, all centered around one very dominant, very experienced lead female family member, and quite interestingly, with no permanent male family members. Obviously, male calves will be born, but when they hit puberty, similar to us, at somewhere between the age of probably about 10 and maybe as late as 15 or 16, testosterone starts to become a problem. They get boisterous, and perhaps most importantly, they start to become sexually interested in female family members. But the cows know exactly what is going on, and it is at that point that they will begin to put pressure on that individual to leave. Bulls kind of start to fall back behind these groups, keeping a greater and greater distance until eventually they separate completely and seek out groups of other males, which will operate as kind of a support structure until they're old enough to return briefly to these groups to find females to mate with. Definitely, there is an estrus cow in this group. You can see the bull approaching from the left there, looking very interested, and there's quite a bit of tension. These cows are not thrilled about having him so nearby. Amorous bulls can be quite boisterous things, and it's quite possible that other cows can kind of be injured in the crossfire, cows and smaller calves, but obviously he serves his purpose. I wonder if we're going to see elephants mating here at Tembe today. Could be. It would be very special, very rare. And following a successful coupling, the activity of mating, then begins the longest gestation period of any mammal to walk on land on Earth. 22 months, so nearly 2 years. Following which a calf between 50 and 100 kilograms is born. And should that calf be born female, it is the beginning of a lifelong relationship between mother and daughter that could play out until the adult cow's death in her late 50s. So in some cases, mums and daughters could be together for 30, 40 years at a time. And that is a seriously, seriously long-lasting and very close bond, close relationship. So certainly a very complex social structure for elephants with long-lasting relationships and certainly this long-running theme that their bonds last for decades. So with all of that in mind, I urge you to look at elephants kept in places like Europe and North America in captive conditions, and in particular elephants kept solitarily, elephants kept on their own. I urge you to look at those sort of situations through different lenses. Those are not happy animals at all. Anyway, I think it's time now to check out a clip. Something quite exciting happening on the Olifants River during the night. Check it out. So a little nighttime swim on Olifants West Game Reserve, one of Afrikaan's other fields, showing that elephants don't do a whole lot of sleeping through the night. When it's nice and warm in the summer, we do tend to see them coming down to rivers and dams for a swim, and certainly continuing that relentless pursuit of food. And while the Olifants River is the home of the Nile crocodile, these guys are not in too much danger of attacks from crocs. They are occasionally grabbed on the tips of their trunks by crocodiles. Thought that might be one passing behind. It's just a logodile. So they can occasionally be grabbed on their trunks, but I've never ever heard of an adult elephant being pulled into the water by a croc. They're just too big, too strong. Very, very nice. But back here at Tembe now, things are ongoing around the mud wallow. Conditions are quite hot and humid here in Tembe today. So all the more reason to have a bit of a splash of nice cooling mud. Elephants obviously have a very, very wrinkly skin, which is reckoned to be something like 60% more effective in trapping moisture, retaining it, and reducing the effects of evaporation. And that all vastly increases their efficiency in terms of keeping cool when things are hot. And once again, they don't produce any sweat, so they have to have the ability to do this. Kenneth Gamble says Isilo, the tusker who lived in Tembe, was a magnificent animal. Kenneth, I know exactly who you are talking about. For anybody who doesn't know, Isilo, Isilo, the elephant bull is certainly worth a Google. I was chatting about these elephant super tuskers that occasionally emerge in Tembe. Isilo was the king of these super tuskers in KZN. Yeah, he's certainly worth a Google, worth a look. A one-of-a-kind animal. I think, unfortunately, now he has passed away, but he lived a long, very full, very healthy life, and without a doubt fathered countless elephant calves in this area. So hopefully, with any luck, his genetic material lives on. He left behind a living legacy. Moonbeam Smith has asked, how often do they actually locate the collared ellies per day, per week? Moonbeam, I think it varies. You probably find the elephants are under quite regular surveillance, and occasionally these collared individuals can be slightly problematic individuals. So they're ellies that are sort of more regularly encountered, leaving parks and such. But yeah, otherwise it's based on sort of the needs of the scientists that are keeping track of them. If they need to find these ellies, if they haven't been spotted in a couple of days, they can climb in a light aircraft, a helicopter, do a bit of flying over these wilderness areas with a telemetry set, and they can be tracked down. It's pretty ancient technology, that radio telemetry. I think it dates back from as early as the 40s or even earlier. So I've used those telemetry sets a couple of times from a light plane, trying to track lions. The tech is very fiddly though. I think it's being replaced with GPS equipment in some of the reserves, and that's a bit more reliable, a bit easier to use, certainly a lot less fiddly. Yeah, quite a few fairly amorous looking bulls in this area, without a doubt being drawn in by one of these females. But their presence is not necessarily a guarantee of getting the opportunity to mate with that cow. And the cows, after all, are notoriously fussy when it comes to picking a mate, as they should be. Cows tend to only mate with bulls, or allow bulls to sire offspring when those bulls are the very biggest and most dominant in the entire ecosystem. So yeah, it can certainly be quite tough for a lot of these younger bulls. They're looking at about 20 or 30 years after puberty before females will even look at them. So hence quite a bit of frustration, and occasionally they take it out on the zebra, the impala, and the warthogs that are around. Tina Skilton says, Mudpack, great for the wrinkles. Definitely, Tina. An African spa treatment. So, if you viewed an elephant up close, you probably wouldn't be advocating for a mudpack's great effective qualities. Yeah, they are certainly very, very wrinkly beasts. There is so much water around here at Tembe. The rains have been great this year. The same can't be said for all of our locations. A couple of Wild Earth and Africam's feeds are looking quite dry. And El Nino kind of shifting into La Nina is a big problem for the southern hemisphere this season. Rain overall has been quite disappointing. We do seem long term to be gripped by these cycles of wet and dry. We have 3 or 4 almost flood-riddled years, and then almost no rainfall at all in some places. But nature, to some degree, does seem to be a self-regulating system, so I guess there are benefits even in the hard times. The situation only gets really critical if animals are completely fenced in. Perhaps on a much smaller privately owned reserve where they don't have the ability to move to greener pastures, so to speak, areas with more food, more water, in effect a migration, and then you have animals starving and really starting to suffer. At that point, it's the responsibility of the reserve or the property owner to start providing, often at immense expense, devastating expense. If you think an elephant is eating something like a quarter ton, over 500 pounds of food a day, it can be very, very difficult to have those needs met, especially when you're talking about possibly dozens or hundreds of elephants at a time. All the more reason to have these reserves large and protected in their entirety. Give the animals the means to find those resources, have all of their needs met in times of sort of easy going as well as times of drought. Alrighty, I think let's keep things moving now that our Ellies are drifting off out of sight there. Let's head to Vic Falls once again. So back up at Victoria Falls, we're at a slightly different Africam camera feed, and not the vulture restaurant itself. But we are looking at a number of vultures and a marabou stork, almost certainly individuals that would have attended that breakfast service that was provided for them. Again, in an earlier segment, I mentioned that vultures and other kind of scavenging birds, once they have had a good feed, will often come down to the water, have a bit of a splash, do some preening, some grooming of their feathers, and have a much needed drink. I think that's what's gone on here today. So yeah, somewhat cleaner than you might think. That can't always be said for the marabou stork, which is actually quite famous for urinating and defecating on its own legs and feet. Now, we're not 100% sure why they do that, but occasionally their legs and feet are stained white by the uric acid in their excrement. And the thoughts are that possibly the acids in that urea help to kill bacteria, which would obviously be very useful as they're wandering around and in amongst the bodies of dead, rotting animal carcasses. That's a very good view of a marabou there. Quite scruffy looking things. But yeah, once again, beauty is all in the eye of the beholder, and it's not always all about looks. They serve an extremely vital function in cleaning up dead, decaying animal material, and quite literally directly preventing the spread of disease. Tracy, hello. Tracy asks, "Do I keep a bird list?" Tracy, when I was guiding full time, I did keep a bird list, but I've kind of let it slide. While I understand a lot of the twitchers or the people that are very very keen bird watchers do, it's never really been a huge focus in my time in the bush. To be honest, I do like the birds. I do find them very interesting. But yeah, I guess as an individual, I just don't have the drive to see thousands and thousands of different species. Or certainly to keep track. And interest in birds is a very, very valuable quality, though. If you find yourself spending time out in the bush, and the presence of mammals, the high-profile species is not always guaranteed. Very impressive wingspan on that marabou. So yeah, if you can find interest in something like birds or reptiles or frogs or butterflies, I like the butterflies a lot, your time in nature will always be full and interesting. And we do like to keep these safaris and even these live at the Waterhole shows as holistic as possible. Try and get a bit of a look at everything. I find it all pretty fascinating. Not all about predators, even though we do like them. It might seem a bit peculiar that these vultures are all just hanging around, seemingly not really doing anything on the ground in the shade. But if you think about it, it's quite costly in terms of spending energy to just sort of fly around the entire time. Vultures are remarkably efficient when it comes to gliding around, using as little of their energy reserves to achieve that movement as possible, but still it costs. So when given the opportunity, in particular on a hot day, it's probably quite intelligent to sit in the shade. On occasion, after a large feed, we see vultures on the ground, and I think they don't really have too much choice in the matter. The belief is that they eat so much food, and in some cases between 2.5 and 5 kilograms each of meat in a sitting, that they are simply not able to fly. So while they wait to digest a bit of that meat and reduce their takeoff weight, they hunker down in the shade. A bit like an overloaded jumbo jet. They can't get the run up they need to get off the ground, so they've got to wait. Three marabou storks on the scene now, also taking the time to come in and have a bit of a drink, I'm sure. We've also got a blacksmith lapwing, and that really tiny little guy running around in the shallows is probably a three-banded plover. Now, marabou storks, rather, are not migratory birds at all. They are permanent residents out here in Africa. Oh, some helmeted guinea fowl crossing there. So they are permanent residents throughout the year here in Africa. I think their movements are far more controlled by the availability of food. So obviously they will fly quite vast distances, but it's not to do with following the seasons. It's interesting, though, that the concept of bird migrations, which is only a scientific idea, probably about 150 years old, actually originated from storks. More specifically, the European white stork, which is a summer visitor to much of southern Africa. We see them in parts of Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, South Africa, and they make an epic trek as the seasons shift from as far south as South Africa to as far north in the northern hemisphere as places like Belgium, Germany, and even Holland, where I've seen them. But as little as 150 years ago, the top birding experts in the world, when questioned as to where the birds disappeared to when winter fell in the northern hemisphere, believed such peculiar things as birds must be going into the sea. Seriously, only 150 years ago, the top scientists in the world thought that all the swallows were diving into the ocean and returning when spring came in Europe once again. It was only when a stork was discovered arriving back in Germany with an African arrow through its breast, obviously fired at that bird by some sort of African tribe somewhere in North Africa. And that bird had made something like a 5,000 kilometer migration with a 3 or 4 foot arrow and spear through its body. And that bird, it's actually worth a Google. So Google stork with an arrow through it. I believe it's been taxidermied. It's in some sort of museum somewhere there in Europe. And it was from that scientists were sort of encouraged to change their views somewhat and investigate the possibility that birds were sensitive to the seasons and capable of flying across the world in search of better conditions. We live and we learn. I wonder how much of what we think we know now will be changed as science improves into the next century. Obviously, many of us will not be around to learn about those discoveries, but hopefully we will learn things as science improves. Again, things looking pretty dusty and dry here in the northern part of Zimbabwe, up at Victoria Falls. So while the east coast of Africa, certainly Mozambique, KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, have had good rainfall, much of central, western and the northern parts of the southern half of the continent have been bitterly disappointed. Thank goodness for a couple of these artificially provided waterholes. They are a lifesaver. Plate Smasher says that sounds like the most uncomfortable flight in history. Plate Smasher, can you imagine? Yeah. Now, once again, though, a testament to the resilience of wild things, the ability to overcome impediments and pain and suffering and to just carry on. Talk about a drive to survive. Quite a few more of these vultures coming in. I wonder if we might see a little bit of bathing. Also, perhaps most of them taking off. Yeah, certainly this landscape looks quite leafy with the predominance of Mapani woodland. Mapani, a species of tree well adapted to these dry conditions. So it might look quite appetizing for a vegetarian animal for some of our herbivores, but in truth there is not a whole lot that can actually feed on these trees. Elephants do, but I believe the nutritive value of Mapani leaves and twigs is very, very low. So certainly tough times and tough conditions coming into the dry season, which we're about to encounter for our herbivores. I'm sure it'll be a time where our carnivores, our lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, etc., will cash in. There'll be lots of weak herbivores this dry season. Cass Pennick, nice to hear from you, and thanks for your comment. Nice to chat a little bit more about natural history as well. The natural world is, for me at least, an endless source of entertainment. Joan Mello says, I have never seen so many vultures at a watering hole before. Yeah, it is great to see them in these big concentrations, Joan. I think, again, that stems from the proximity of that vulture restaurant. There are loads of vultures in this area. This whole Victoria Falls area is quite amazing. Even Vic Falls town in Zimbabwe has elephants fairly regularly walking down the streets. I've heard frequent reports of lions and leopards passing through. Certainly the odd buffalo here or there. So it is a wild, wild place. And a bit of a tourism hub. A visit to Victoria Falls is one of those bucket list trips. Got to do it once. And the wildlife of Zimbabwe hasn't had the toughest, or hasn't had the easiest last few decades, thanks to some pretty tragic political problems. I think the Parks Department has been gravely underfunded and not prioritized. So the ecotourism sector out there desperately needs support. There are still some outrageous wilderness areas out there. Mana Pools, Lake Kariba, Wangi National Park, all sort of within the vicinity, are top wildlife destinations, and sort of off the beaten track as well. So you kind of avoid the crowds when you go out there and visit. Yeah, thankfully still quite a few very, very dedicated conservationists and people putting their lives on the line, brave men and women acting as rangers, protecting the last elephants and black rhinos that call this place home. More power to them, and we certainly need more people like that on Earth. And that fairly dark bird walking across the open area there is one lone helmeted guinea fowl, a kind of a game bird species, a little bit like some of the pheasants you might find in parts of the northern hemisphere. Usually flocking birds, so you'd expect to see them with some others. Joan Mello says she would love to see the falls. Must be beautiful. Joan, it absolutely is. Yeah, I hope you have the opportunity at some stage to get up there. It is beautiful. Now these guinea fowl are very much a species of game bird. So in some places they are hunted for their meat. But my late grandfather once said to me, the best way to prepare a guinea fowl that you've cooked is to take a large clay brick, place it in the bottom of a sort of a large cooking pot, especially if you're out in nature, maybe camping. Place the plucked bird on top of that brick, put a bit of water up to the surface level of that brick, chop up some root vegetables, some nice carrots, potatoes, turnips, that sort of thing, or rather, and place them sort of up to the top level of the bird. Cook in the open fire until the bird is lovely and golden brown, and then chuck the guinea fowl out and chomp onto the brick, because it's going to be more tender than a wild guinea. So perhaps we just stick to domestic chickens. But in the interest of keeping things moving, I think let's head over to Stony Point to see what's happening along South Africa's coast. Very, very nice. So a couple of rock hyraxes doing a bit of basking in the sun here. Now these are a little species of mammal that we don't get to spend all that much time with under many normal circumstances across our other feeds. They're very, very specialized in terms of the kind of conditions and the terrain they actually need in which to survive. Totally at home amongst these rocks. And they are herbivores, so they kind of browse and graze as they move. But they have to have these rocky recesses in which to bolt for survival. Some of their biggest predators, certainly in this Cape region, are the eagles. The black eagle lives off of an almost hyrax exclusive diet, and they will also be caught by the Cape's resident population of caracals, some of which get enormous down there, and even the Cape leopard, which is also a Dussie specialist. Quite a nice opportunity to have a look at this little rock hyrax's back feet, and that leads to quite an incredible fact about their biology and certainly their natural history. Such odd little animals. The closest relative in the wild for the rock hyrax, after all, is the African elephant. How bizarre is that? You'd be forgiven for thinking they're like a little furry rodent or something like that. They're only tiny, 5 or 6 kgs in weight, but it is in fact the African elephant, and the secret lies in those feet. And if you x-ray a rock hyrax's front and rear foot, they have the same number of toes as the African elephant. They also have a set of tusks in the upper jaw, lateral incisors, and a very similar stomach system. Yeah, but you would be forgiven, as I say, for thinking it would be any other species on the planet. Plate Smasher asks, have the great white sharks returned? Now, for anybody who doesn't know what Plate Smasher is asking about, we had a situation along South Africa's coastline, the south coast, where historically, I mean, this entire area has been a phenomenal habitat for great whites. Some of the healthiest densities of great white sharks on Earth can be found here. But we had a number of orcas, killer whales, that took up residence here for a while and absolutely decimated the great white population. They're literally killing these apex predators, these immense sharks. And I think the belief was that the the killer whales, the orcas, were eating some of the internal organs and then just leaving these carcasses. But I believe the killer whales or the orcas have moved on, and I think those great whites are starting to return. Plate Smasher. Yeah, crazy stuff. Now, while these rock hyraxes don't exactly have the same foot structure as the elephant in terms of kind of a lack of externally visible toes or a big flat foot pad for life in the savannas, these guys are highly evolved to scurry among the rocks. And they've got very, very grippy toe pads, a bit like the soles on like a sporty pair of trainers. But yeah, not a whole lot of jumping going on today. These guys are just enjoying some very welcome sunshine down in the Cape. Right next to this very chilly ocean, the winds can be vicious, very cold temperatures, drizzly conditions for ages, and certainly the nights can be bitterly cold. Before I was born, my late grandmother actually hand-raised one of these little rock hyraxes. I'm not 100% sure how she how she came to possess this little orphan Hyrax. But she was an extremely kind and gentle woman, so I'm sure she empathized with him. And anyway, she raised this little thing. But a fact of rock hyrax behavior and biology is that they always visit the bathroom in the same place. So when it came to potty training this little hyrax and keeping the house clean, she managed to get him to go to the bathroom on sort of a folded up piece of paper towel in a saucer, which was obviously placed for him on the ground. And then she could quite conveniently go to the bathroom, tip all of his leavings into the toilet, and flush it all away quite conveniently. But anyway, this little rock hyrax eventually cut out the middleman, and I think the scent of his urine, probably a very little fine residue in the bathroom, drew him in there. And for quite a while, he actually learned to sit on the toilet seat and kind of do his business right there, which was pretty convenient and pretty amazing. But then, unfortunately, a time came where my gran was away, and this poor little hyrax fell into the toilet, and that was the end of the story. So, perhaps they're not as evolved for a life in a captive or a human environment after all. Lots of hazards when you are so small and you have no ability to swim. And they certainly do seem to be driven, or rather drawn to human constructions and human habitation, in particular around this Cape region. We have problems every single year when people come down from places as far away as Johannesburg by car. They park at these lovely tourist points along the coast here in the Cape, and hyraxes, in an attempt to get out of the wind, they climb into the undercarriage of that vehicle, climb up into the body, into the chassis, and then people hop in their cars, drive all the way back to Johannesburg, many thousands of kilometers out of the way, arrive at home, and a rock hyrax jumps out in the garage. So I hear stories every year about wildlife rehabbers that have to sort of gather these little hyraxes up and try and return them to where they belong, down in the Cape. That's a properly African problem. Lady Macbeth says Dussie lavatories are very obvious at 12 in Namibia. Apologies for my pronunciation there. Afrikaans is definitely a limited skill set for me. But Lady Macbeth, I know exactly what you're talking about. In areas where these Dussies or rock hyraxes are very well established, the streaks from their urine and their droppings stain the rocks. So often where you have lovely smooth granite boulders, those streaks are extremely prominent and they last for years. Always a very good visual sign at a distance of the presence of the hyraxes. But you can certainly see why these hyraxes like it here at Stony Point. Loads and loads of crevices in which they can shelter and in which they can escape from their many predators. And the guy right on the top there just heading up to those succulents to have a bit of a nibble. Succulents are an excellent source of moisture for many species of mammals. They're obviously famous for their water content, and in a place like this, there is little to no fresh standing water for these hyraxes to drink. So a very, very convenient opportunity to have those needs met. And it looks like these hyraxes keep this trimmed like a hedge. Joan Mello asks, do seals visit this area? Joan, I don't know the Stony Point area extremely well, but I would think that Cape fur seals are very well distributed throughout the area, so there shouldn't be any reason why we wouldn't get a view of one on the rocks, perhaps. But yeah, certainly this area is known as the Wild Coast for some very good reasons. And not only is this place kind of filled with wild and interesting species, both in the ocean and on the land, but it's also battered by some pretty severe and wild weather conditions. And you can see those effects on these rocks over millions of years. And even in the types of plants that do occur here, these feiries and other succulents are specialists for life in a very tough landscape. And what a pleasure here with Wild Earth and Africam to be taking such a vast and varied look at so many different landscapes, ecosystems, biomes, as we kind of hop between these camera feeds. Variety is the spice of life. Alrighty, well, while this Hyrax investigates some kelp here on the beach at Stony Point, let's head back up to Tembe and have a look at what's happening up there. So back up at Tembe, and our elephants are certainly not going anywhere. A colossal bull emerging from the vegetation far at the back, and what looks like a nice mixed breeding group out in these wonderful grasslands at the moment. That is a big bull. Certainly could be a contender in terms of getting some mating done if one of these females is indeed in estrus, as we thought earlier. I mentioned in an earlier segment that females seem to be drawn to the biggest of bulls. Certainly they do seem to choose their mates based on height, bulk, the length of tusks, the width of the head, all apparently telltale indicators of very good, strong genes. And the fact of the matter is that kind of naturally encourages the cows to gravitate towards those last few super tuskers, thus ensuring the continuation of those very, very special genetic lineages. Long may Africa be home to living mammoths in our elephant tuskers. These early cows taking a moment to have a bit of a drink from that very green looking waterhole at the back. But this is just a youngster. In essence, sort of a small child, somewhere around 8 to 10 years of age, I would estimate, and a young bull. So pre-pubescent. And this chap seems to have a deformed back left leg. Sort of a club foot. It happens sometimes. It's pretty rare for elephants to break leg bones. The legs are just so big and so bulky. But that could have been a birth defect. Doesn't seem to trouble this Ellie too much, though it must take some strain putting all that bulk on a slightly weakened leg. Certainly, though, its physical condition is an indication that it is doing absolutely fine. Ellies in particular seem to be very good at managing with disabilities, provided they can move. They can deal with all sorts of things. Saleli is asking if that algae is toxic. Saleli, if you're talking about the green stuff that's floating on the water at the back there, it's not actually algae. It's something called a water cabbage, which is a species of aquatic plant, unfortunately alien and very invasive, which has come in from South America. And at the rate it reproduces, it cannot be consumed fast enough by the animals. It is palatable to some degree, I believe, but it's also very fibrous. It's not too nutritious, so the animals don't seem to love to eat it. And it rapidly forms a carpet across the entire water's surface, which might not seem like too much of an issue, but for the functionings in that water itself, it traps or prevents all of the sunlight from kind of entering, which means that any aquatic plants below the surface start to die, and many species below that rely on exposure to sunlight for their health also suffer. So it's really, really nasty stuff, and in many parts of South Africa, initiatives are underway to try and take it out of there. Obviously, it's not ideal to spray herbicides in natural areas because herbicides tend to kill all the plants. And definitely we don't want chemicals going into the drinking water of all the animals. Mercedes Bean says, I'll bet 1 ton, aka Mr. Tusks, which is a large elephant bull that lives in the area of Oldonyo, has bewitched many a cow. Can't argue with that. I'm sure he's very popular with the ladies up there. And no problems with that. Hopefully he's producing lots of calves, which will one day produce tusks possibly as big as his. But yeah, certainly in terms of that floating water cabbage, something has got to be done. It's all over the show. I believe there are types of insects that can be introduced which specifically parasitize that plant. It can be very effective at removing it. But the problem with introducing a species into an area where it doesn't belong, I think the bugs come from somewhere else, possibly South America as well, is that once they've successfully destroyed all of that water cabbage, what are they supposed to eat? And then we face a problem when those bugs start destroying some sort of indigenous plant. So these bio issues can be a bit troubling. But ultimately, humans were the ones who were responsible for introducing it, so we should be the ones to figure it out. Clean up our mess. A big cow crossing over there with just a single tusk. Now that's quite common. We do see it from time to time. Now, while elephants can, of course, break tusks off, it's quite likely in that particular case that she damaged the tusk's root when she was only a calf, and the tusk simply never grew. Now, that chap on the other side is a very big bull, certainly one of the biggest and bulkiest in the area. He has every chance to access the mating rights amongst these cows. Jive Bunny says, "Cute little elephants." Definitely, Jive Bunny. I don't think I've ever met anybody on a safari who doesn't find a baby elephant totally captivating. Mindy Tilpow has asked, "Could you manually pull the invasive plants out?" Mindy, you absolutely could, and we saw it recently on South Africa's Vaal River, a river that flows through a couple of our provinces, but I think in that case it was in Gauteng, and teams of volunteers were going into the water and pulling out hyacinth, which is a similar floating water plant, pulling it up onto land and burning it. That's probably the most sustainable way to do it, but very, very, very labor intensive, and I would say quite tricky in a place like Tembe, because obviously there are lots of wild animals in the area and possibly even crocodiles in the water. So a very tricky situation. So it's very probable that this water weed or this floating water cabbage was not introduced on purpose, but unfortunately, very often when boats are kind of moved from one water system to another, they contain the spores of water plants. So people who do take the boat or the jet skis out have got a big responsibility to make sure those vehicles are nice and clean when they're moved big distances across the country. Don't want to take stuff like that and introduce it accidentally somewhere else. Looks like that enormous bull is coming this way. He doesn't have a set of tusks that would cause us to kind of name him a tusker, but a very impressive set of ivory nonetheless. and you can see some somewhat slightly excitable and also perhaps at the same time nervous behavior from some of these cows around him. Keeping in mind this bull is probably 40% bigger than even the biggest lady in this herd. Bulls also have a reputation for being quite boisterous, but provided he's not musty, a chap this big should be quite gentle. Hopefully he can sniff out that pregnant, or rather that estrus cow, the cow that is ovulating, and the next generation of African elephants will be on the way. But unfortunately, we only have about 2 minutes left before we wrap up live at the Waterhole for the afternoon. And yeah, so it's probably pretty much time for me to say goodbye to you. But I'll be back with you for another installment of Live at the Waterhole again, same time tomorrow. So be sure to pop on by. Let's chat all things wildlife and nature tomorrow once again. Diane in the UK says she tried to get water hyacinth to grow in her garden pond and was unsuccessful. That is rather ironic. Of course, when we want it, we can't have it, and when we don't want it, it's a plague. Spas, thank you very much for your comment. Always great to spend it with so many of you Wild Earth viewers. And definitely until next time. But from myself, the naturalist Liam Burrow, as well as our team of directors and all of the unseen faces here at Wild Earth doing the hard work behind the scenes, we'd like to say a big thank you for joining us. Have a wild day, and we'll chat to you sometime soon.